Hey there everyone, it's Dirty H here and I'd like to welcome you to the very first episode of City Skylines Europe. Now, I've decided to call it City Skylines Europe because I'm going to be taking influence from the entire continent of Europe. There's so many beautiful places and countries and things, and I didn't want to limit myself to just one particular city. And I wanted to start with the old town part of the city and actually grow it organically, so I've taken inspiration for this very first part from an Austrian city called Hallstatt, and I hope I pronounced that correctly. I probably haven't, so apologies if that's terrible in your Austrian. But this is a very picturesque little city, and it's very unique in that there's a part that's only pedestrian only, pretty old town style, so I thought that would be perfect to start this city and series with. This is the first time I've ever used the height mapper before. When making a map, I've made the map from scratch and I've used the actual area around Hallstatt, and terrain party wasn't available, which is I guess what would normally be used to make these height maps, so I've had to find an alternative site. And the first time I used it, I got these crazy lines everywhere, and it turns out I had like the highways in white, so they came into the game all raised up. But the second time I did the height map, it came out really nice. The scale was pretty well bang on. The mountains did look a little bit small, but in game I use a different perspective for my cinematic shot and it stands the mountains up considerably. So when we look at the view from where Hallstatt is across the mountains, I'm pretty happy with this. It's pretty close. Like I say, the mountains look a little bit flat at the moment, but that perspective of the camera in game really changes their look. I did also think about doing a map like a London, pretty flat, easy to build on, but there's something far more appealing about doing a landscape like this, and also there's the knowledge that I can terraform it in game later if I need to. So anyway, let me give you guys an insight into why I have chosen to do a European series. And I'll start with the two main reasons. Number one, I absolutely love the architecture, especially the really old town parts of the cities. And number two, I really wanted to challenge myself with height differences in the game. We all know how horrible height differences are to work with, but they look so much more realistic, and it's so much more satisfying when you pull those areas off. So that is going to be a massive focus of this series, is really working with at sometimes extreme terrain changes, and you will see exactly that in this very first episode. Like I said earlier, we start with the old town and I want to grow this city organically and naturally, and it would start with an old town, and the characteristics of an old town, as far as I can tell, are just crazy streets all over the place that really don't make a hell of a lot of sense, and a lot of pedestrian only areas. These roads were not built for vehicles, obviously, so I'm really looking forward to the challenge of trying to pull this off in game. I've even gone as far as just putting one really crappy road into the city to try and keep it as natural as possible. I think it would be silly to have a big highway running into this tiny town that might be 1,000 years old. It does, however, mean that I'm going to have to load up on some extra mods later on to get train lines and such into the city, because I haven't added any to this map whatsoever. But that's okay. I'm willing to deal with that when the time comes. Anyway, you'll see me here start to experiment with different cliff textures and grass textures and watercolors and all of those things with Theme Mixer 2, which is just a fantastic mod. I just jumped on the workshop and downloaded a whole bunch of different textures and themes and stuff like that, and no, I'm sorry, I don't have a list for them. Just jump on there and there's a whole bunch. They're easy to find. And in terms of trees, I just looked up what the native trees in the area were. In this case it's Austria, and they were just mainly firs, beech and oak, with of course some pines chucked in there. And a little tip here that's worked for me in the past, and you see me doing it here, is I use little wee trees as we get further up the mountain. This can really help with scaling and making the mountains look much higher than they really are. And then I pretty much just finish off the map just doing little wee bushes and little wee plots of trees here and there just randomly. And now with the map completely finished, I can start putting in some of these buildings and start building this little wee village. Now, I have no idea which direction this city is going to go, and this could end up being a huge European city, or it could be just a tiny little wee thing. I have no idea. I'm going to go with your guys' comments as well. So, as you can imagine, this little wee road here coming into the city could be massively inadequate later on if we decide to build it really, really big. But, like I've been saying, I want to do it organically and naturally, and this just seems like the way that it would be done, you know, all those years ago. In terms of architecture, there wasn't too much on the workshop from Austria or Austrian themed, which is mainly wood buildings with these really unique steep gables. It must be to shed snow. So I was disappointed there was none of those, but I've just downloaded some really nice general European buildings from the workshop, and I've tried to stick with ones with nice textures from known creators. And I've also tried to capture the building of the city from unique angles so you guys can get a really good perspective and a good feel for what I'm doing here. These are real streets that I've used here that I found on the workshop that look awesome, and I've had to use the traffic manager to stop the trucks and stuff going up the road. And I've clipped most of these buildings and props well over the road, so we do get a fair amount of clipping in this area. But this just looks great. These little narrow alleyways and stuff are so cute. My wife, for instance, is not too much of a fan of the game, but she absolutely loves this little wee part of the city here, so I must be doing something right. And I think my favourite part about all of these little wee props I'm adding in here is the ivy. It's from Ronix69 on the workshop. This ivy, I've put it over a whole lot of the buildings, and some of them are even completely covered in it, and it just really makes this city look so good. So after I've added all the main things like stairs and platforms outside of the little wee buildings, I can start adding way more detail with like handrails and planters and shop signs. And I tried my best to use old looking assets as well, like old stone fences and things like that, because obviously that's exactly what we're going for with this part of the city. We want it to be as old looking and feeling as possible. And I guess that's where this ivy has its place. It can just turn these buildings into really old looking buildings, and you also see me place a lot of it along the fences and creeping down retaining walls and things like that. And yeah, I just couldn't believe the difference that it gave the city when I started adding it in. But in saying that, it can be also very tedious and it takes a long time to put it in. After installing what felt like 1,000 bits of ivy, I could finally start detailing the front of some of these shops, and a lot of them are just little cute flower shops and things like that, because there's lots of props for those types of shops on the workshop. And also I've got a few markets from the France pack from Jazeez off the Steam workshop as well. So all of these little props combine and come together to really bring these streets to life. And what I do to bring the pedestrians down here, seen as they're actually clipping through the buildings, is I put pedestrian paths over top of the middle of the road to get them walking up and down the little narrow streets, and that's the final piece of the puzzle that really brings this all to life. And to do that, obviously I've used the invisible paths and just made little entrances and exits every sort of 50 meters along the alleyway. So now you'll see me start to work with some of these elevation changes, and you can see how drastic some of them are here, and my technique is pretty well the same and will be the same for most of these areas throughout the city, and it's just to use these big concrete blocks, turn them into procedural objects and create a basic shape with those first, i.e. where we want the ground levels to be. And once this is done, I can start installing stairs and creating pathways from different levels. And I really wanted to make a point to make every single part of this city as detailed as I possibly can, hence why I might be keeping this a very small city. I'm not too sure yet, but that detailing even includes these areas here that are just supposedly an alleyway from one place to another. They're all going to have little wee small, like for instance pot plants and stuff like that, fancy handrails, maybe a little restaurant hidden down an alleyway somewhere, all of those types of things. And I'm also going to make sure that all of these levels are accessible with usable pedestrian paths and maybe just cube surfaces in some of the buildings that have been modified with procedural objects. And once I'd finished with the basic shape and I had the stairs in, I could start doing the little wee props. I changed some of the textures on some of the concrete to a nicer texture, or rather a more appropriate texture that looks a little older. Then I can start introducing a few more buildings that have been modified with PO, and I try my best to mainly use the buildings with the red terracotta roofing, because from my observations most of these old towns have that style of roof. And these ones I've got off the workshop look fantastic. The textures are just bang on. And once I'd finished adding in all the props to this area, it just looked so good. I ended up staring at this area for quite a while. I was quite proud of myself for how this came out, to be honest. It was quite challenging and it took hours obviously, but I'm really pleased with that. In particular, there's this really nice cobblestone decal that I've applied to these levels, and that I think has really added something. This is the part where I decided to get the traffic manager mod and get rid of these horrid cars ruining my beautiful streets. Man, what is up with the one painted with all the flowers on it? Like, who on earth would drive that around? Anyway, be gone. I changed the parking settings here so no one can park on the streets, and also only emergency vehicles are allowed up the road. So there is the odd truck that'll go up the road, but it's only one here and there. And then you'll see me tackle another really steep incline with these terrain differences, and we're following the same principles with the stairs and the blocks as before, except this one here is going to run a little bit differently. It's going to have a sort of abandoned patch of scrub out the back of this building and just be generally a little bit more untidy than the last one. And now's probably a good time to give a shout out to some of these asset creators. So some of my favourite asset creators, and I apologise if I've missed you, by all means if you're watching put a comment, but my favourite would have to be Titan, Armesto and probably Lost Gecko. Those three are amazing. So if you're after old European buildings and much more, those are probably a good three to start with. Especially if you're intending on using procedural objects to make the buildings larger. This can sometimes expose crappy textures and make them look even worse, so starting with a good asset, and these guys put hours into these things by the way, starting with that good asset is everything. And just quickly, I don't know if you guys have seen the new asset from Ronix. It's the big San Francisco hall, I think it is. It is just it's incredible. Like, I haven't even got words for that. It's crazy, and I really hope he is getting some serious commissions for that, because that would have taken years to make. It is Mr. Ronix after all. He's an absolute beast. But anyway guys, this is what this area looks like when it's finished, and you can see I've gone pretty hardcore with the vines again. They're climbing up the retaining wall, and there's much more bush and just a sort of crappy area behind that building. But we are going to offset this area with a really nice area where we move to next. So the last bit of terrain difference that we tackle in this first episode is this bit just here, and I end up turning this into a couple of really nice restaurants with an archway running over some stairs with vines and stuff all over it, and I had a very clear picture in my head of what I wanted this area to look like. I also put some cube services in this little niche that was created here that the city desperately needs, and I use another building by Titan to cover those over later on. But I was really focused on making an area here that I'd like to go and sit down myself and have a meal at, and it's really cute and beautiful and all of the things you would expect from a restaurant in Europe. And just quietly, I am stoked I finally get to use this exposed cobble decal that I've had for like 3 years just sitting in my collection, and it's so appropriate here and looks even better. It makes the area look really aged. And with that, guys, we have finished the first episode. That is a heap of building and detailing for the first episode, so I'm wrapped. I hope you guys enjoyed that, and I hope you're ready for more. So I hope to see you there. Hit that subscribe button if you liked it, and take care of yourselves, and I will hopefully see you on episode 2. See you later, guys.